Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore the power of resilience, justice, and the human spirit. Today's story takes us into the heart of one man's unexpected journey to reclaim dignity and confront a system that tried to silence him. Get ready for a tale of courage, love, and profound transformation. It was a warm spring evening in Grandview, Illinois, a quiet town nestled just far enough from the chaos of Chicago to feel like a sanctuary. Life in the town was simple but vibrant. The streets were alive with people enjoying the fading sunlight, couples strolling hand in hand, and children laughing as they raced on bicycles. Amid this scene of peace walked David Brooks, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a life filled with resilience. David had come to the United States as a refugee years ago, fleeing Eritrea in search of safety and opportunity. Now a proud citizen, he had built a life as a truck driver, traversing the country and supporting his family back in Texas. This evening, he was in town for work, his truck parked nearby as he took a rare moment to unwind at a local bar. David wasn't the type to seek out attention. Tall and lean, with a strong but unassuming presence, he often blended into the background, content to observe rather than engage. Tonight, however, something felt different. As he sipped his beer and watched a basketball game on the bar's television, he noticed a pair of men at the far end of the room, their eyes darting toward him. Their expressions weren't friendly. David tried to ignore them, chalking it up to the usual discomfort some people felt around those who looked or sounded different. But their stares persisted, and a knot of unease began to form in his stomach. The two men were Darren Culp and Mark Logan, off-duty federal agents who had been drinking and talking loudly at their table. They weren't from Grandview, but had stopped into town on their way back from a nearby assignment. Their conversation, which had begun as light banter about work, turned darker when they noticed David. To them, his presence was an anomaly, his accent and features sparking unfounded suspicions. Fueled by alcohol and arrogance, they decided to confront him. Culp, a burly man with a history of throwing his weight around, approached David first. "Hey, you," he said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "Where are you from?" David looked up, his calm expression masking the flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "I'm from Texas," he replied simply, his voice steady. "What's it to you?" Culp's lips twisted into a smirk. "Texas? Huh? With that accent? You sure about that?" Before David could respond, Logan joined in, standing just behind Culp. "Let's see some ID," Logan demanded, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The bar had fallen silent, all eyes on the unfolding confrontation. David felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes, but he refused to be intimidated. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his Texas ID. The men examined it, their faces hardening as though they'd found proof of some imagined crime. "This doesn't look right," Culp muttered, though the ID was valid. "You're not supposed to be here, are you?" David's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm a U.S. citizen," he said firmly, "and I've done nothing wrong." Culp's reaction was immediate and aggressive. "We'll see about that," he sneered, grabbing David's arm with unnecessary force. Logan moved in to help, twisting David's other arm behind his back. David winced, but didn't resist, knowing that any struggle would only escalate the situation. The bar patrons watched in stunned silence, too afraid or unwilling to intervene. As the men dragged him outside, David's thoughts raced. This wasn't just an attack on his dignity. It was an attack on everything he had worked so hard to build. The land of opportunity he had dreamed of was, in this moment, a place of humiliation and fear. But even as anger and frustration swirled within him, David resolved to remain composed. He would not let these men strip him of his humanity. The night was far from over, and David could sense that this encounter would have consequences far beyond the small town of Grandview. David found himself shoved against the cold pavement outside the bar. The rough handling from Culp and Logan made his pulse quicken, but he kept his head held high. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal, while patrons inside the bar stared out the windows. Was a familiar echo of struggles he thought he'd left behind. This wasn't about legality, it was about perception, prejudice, and power. He stayed quiet, hoping reason might still find its way into the situation. Culp's grip tightened as Logan barked orders. "Stay down," Logan growled, placing a firm knee on David's lower back. "We're calling immigration. Let them sort this out." David's heart sank. He'd heard stories of others in similar situations, detained unjustly, their identities questioned, their rights ignored. Yet, he wasn't just afraid, he was frustrated. He had every right to be here. His ID, which now sat discarded on the ground, proved as much. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that fear wouldn't help him now. "I told you," David said firmly, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm a U.S. citizen. This is a mistake." Culp laughed bitterly. "A mistake? The only mistake is letting people like you think you can roam around freely. Where's your proof? Huh? Got any papers to back up that claim?" David clenched his teeth, choosing his words carefully. "My proof is in the ID you threw on the ground. That's as real as it gets." Logan looked momentarily uneasy, shifting his weight and glancing at the ID. But Culp wasn't backing down. He was too deep in his self-made authority to admit fault. "You're coming with us?" Culp declared. "We'll let the system figure you out." It was then that David remembered the phone in his pocket. He shifted slightly, slipping his hand toward it without drawing attention. With one practiced motion, he pressed the button to speed dial his wife, who was not only his partner in life, but his greatest ally in moments like this. He didn't say a word, but he knew she would hear what was happening and act swiftly. As the officers hauled David toward a parked car, his wife, Rachel, was already listening. At home in Dallas, Rachel knew the situation was dire the moment she heard Culp's arrogant tone. A seasoned attorney, Rachel had handled countless civil rights cases and knew exactly how to respond. She immediately called the Grandview Police Department and demanded they intervene, her voice sharp with authority. David felt a small flicker of hope as he was pushed into the back seat of the unmarked car. His confidence in Rachel's determination was unshakable, and he trusted her to make the right moves. In the meantime, the men continued to gloat. "You'll see," Culp sneered, glancing at David through the rearview mirror. "This little charade won't last long. Once immigration gets here, they'll know what to do with you." David said nothing, his silence masking the resolve building within him. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity now. He was fighting for the principle that no one should be subjected to this treatment. This was far from over. As the car sped toward the Grandview police station, David stared out the window, his reflection blending with the blur of streetlights. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry. He thought about his father, who had worked tirelessly to give him the opportunities he now had, and his mother, who always reminded him to stand tall in the face of adversity. Their voices echoed in his mind, urging him to keep his composure and remember who he was. The officers were deep in conversation, their laughter punctuated by occasional glances at David in the back seat. "Think he'll cry when immigration shows up?" Logan quipped, his voice dripping with disdain. Culp chuckled. "Probably. They always do. Pretend they've got rights or something." David refused to let their words penetrate his calm exterior. Instead, he focused on the fact that Rachel was likely already taking action. He trusted her sharp mind and relentless drive, knowing she wouldn't rest until she'd turned this situation around. When they arrived at the station, Culp and Logan ushered David through the doors, their smugness apparent to anyone watching. The fluorescent lights inside cast a harsh glare on the worn linoleum floors, and the station buzzed with the routine chaos of late-night arrests. "Put him in holding," Culp instructed one of the officers at the desk. "Claims he's legal, but we're not taking any chances. Immigration can figure it out." The desk officer hesitated, his brows furrowing. "What's the charge?" "Suspicion of being in the country illegally," Culp replied, his tone dismissive. The desk officer glanced at David, then back at Culp. "You sure about this? We're not immigration, and this sounds like a civil matter." Culp waved him off. "Just do it. We got a handle." David sat quietly in the holding cell, his mind racing through the events of the past hour. The walls were cold, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. He noticed the skeptical looks exchanged by a few officers passing by, their expressions hinting at unease with how this situation was being handled. Meanwhile, Rachel was on the move. She contacted the Grandview police chief, explained the situation in precise legal terms, and demanded an immediate resolution. She wasn't just calling as a concerned wife. She was calling as an attorney who understood the weight of civil rights violations and how quickly they could escalate into lawsuits. At the station, tension grew as Rachel's call reached the desk officer. He pulled Culp aside, his voice low but firm. "We got a problem. That guy's wife is on the phone, and she's not just some random caller. She's an attorney, and she's pissed." Culp's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. "So what?" he snapped. "She can't do anything. We're following protocol." The desk officer shook his head. "Protocol or not, she's already on the phone with the chief. You might want to rethink how you're handling this." David, sitting quietly in the cell, caught sight of the exchange and felt a glimmer of satisfaction. The tables were starting to turn, and he knew Rachel was behind it. This was far from over, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. The station grew quieter as the evening dragged on, but the tension in the air thickened. David leaned against the cold metal bench in the holding cell, his mind sharpening with each passing minute. He wasn't just waiting, he was preparing, mentally cataloging every word, every action of the officers who had brought him here. He knew that every detail would matter when the time came to tell his side of the story. Outside, Rachel arrived with an intensity that silenced the officers at the front desk. Her tailored suit and determined stride exuded a power that demanded attention. She carried a folder of documents, her phone clutched in her other hand, still connected to the Grandview police chief, who had instructed her to come straight to the station. "I'm here for my husband, David Kane," Rachel announced, her voice steady but commanding. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't every day that someone walked in with the composure and authority of someone who could dismantle an entire precinct with a single lawsuit. "Wait here," one of them muttered before disappearing into the back. Rachel turned toward the main area of the station, her gaze locking on Culp and Logan as they emerged from the break room. She didn't need an introduction. She knew them immediately by their smug demeanor. Culp's confident stride faltered when he saw her standing there, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "You must be Officer Culp," Rachel said, stepping forward. "And you're Logan. I'm Rachel Kane, David's wife. We need to talk." Culp squared his shoulders, attempting to recover. "Your husband's in holding." "Ma'am, he's under investigation." "For what exactly?" Rachel's questions sliced through the room. "You have no jurisdiction over immigration matters, and David is a U.S. citizen, unless you've charged him with an actual crime. This is an unlawful detention." Logan bristled. He couldn't prove it, didn't have the right answers. Rachel smiled coldly. "And you didn't bother verifying his identification or contacting legal counsel?" "Because I did. And you're going to explain why my husband is in a holding cell when he hasn't committed a single crime." The chief appeared at that moment, his expression tight with restrained anger. "Mrs. Kane," he said, extending a hand, "I'm deeply sorry for this situation. Let me get your husband." As the chief walked toward the holding cells, Rachel turned back to Culp and Logan. "You should both consider this a wake-up call. Civil rights violations don't end well for officers who act on bias and ego. I'll make sure this precinct gets the education it clearly needs." David stepped into the room moments later, his calm composure a perfect mirror to Rachel's. They embraced briefly, the quiet strength between them palpable. Rachel addressed the chief. "I expect a full report on this incident by morning, and your officers will be hearing from my legal team." The chief nodded, his regret evident, as David and Rachel left. Hand in hand, the officers behind them were left to face the fallout of their actions. As they walked out into the cool night air, David inhaled deeply, his lungs filling with relief. Rachel's hand was steady in his, her presence anchoring him in a moment that could have easily broken a weaker spirit. The sound of the city surrounded them. But for a moment, all David could hear was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, syncing with the determination in Rachel's stride. "You handled that like a champion," David said, his voice low but warm. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent thank you for her unwavering support. She looked at him, her eyes softening as she smiled faintly. "Don't think for a second that I was going to let them get away with this," Rachel replied. "They messed with the wrong family." David nodded, his thoughts swirling. "But it's not just about us, Rachel. It's about everyone who's been targeted and silenced. They need to know this isn't okay, ever." Rachel stopped mid-step, turning to face him fully. "And they will know. But first, you're coming home. We need to regroup. And you need rest." The car ride back to their home was filled with conversation, strategizing about the next steps, how to involve the media and legal teams, and how to ensure the officers responsible faced accountability. David's mind was sharp, replaying every word and action from the precinct, knowing it would be pivotal in the days to come. When they arrived home, the house felt both a sanctuary and a symbol of the life they had built together, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. Rachel poured 2 cups of tea as David settled on the couch, his thoughts beginning to crystallize into a plan. "This isn't just about filing complaints or getting an apology," David began, his tone resolute. "It's about systemic change. Those officers weren't just bad apples. They're part of a rotten tree, and we need to cut it down." Rachel set her cup down, her eyes meeting his. "We will. I've already contacted an advocacy group. They want to take your story public. You'll be the face of this fight." David exhaled deeply. "I didn't ask for this, but if it means no one else has to go through what I did tonight, then I'll do it." The days that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and legal proceedings. David's story gained national attention, sparking outrage and discussions about the misuse of power and racial bias in law enforcement. Rachel stood by him at every step, her strategic mind ensuring they stayed one step ahead. Months later, as they stood together on the steps of a courthouse, reporters surrounding them, David reflected on how much had changed. He wasn't just a man fighting for his rights. He had become a voice for the voiceless. Rachel leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're making a difference, David." He smiled. "The weight of the fight no longer is heavy. Together, we are." Thank you for watching this heartfelt episode of Empathy Stories. We hope David's journey inspired you to reflect on the strength of unity and the importance of standing up for what's right. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the soul and uplift the spirit. See you next time.